All right. Good morning. All right. Uh, Today is a kind of bonus lecture. It's not required, but I think that this material is pretty interesting and pretty relevant to some of the things that's going on right now. We're going to be talking about accelerationism. And accelerationism refers to a group of very provocative theories, often misunderstood, that argues that the forces of capitalism, technology, and modernity, these destructive forces that traditional, you know, political liberalism has tried to constrain, well, these forces should not be resisted, but rather they should be intensified and accelerated to bring about some kind of radical social transformation. There are many people who are very dissatisfied with the legacy of humanism and the political and social systems of the current liberal order. Some argue that slow incremental change is no longer an option. Rather, they aim to intensify institutional contradictions and push the system to the breaking point so that something radically new and transformative can emerge. And this kind of reminds me of that very famous saying of Nietzsche and in Zarathustra, that which is falling deserves to be pushed, right? I mean, institutions are failing for a reason. And if we want something better, um, ameliorative change is not going to be good enough. Reform is not going to be good enough. These institutions are kind of rotten to the core, and so they deserve to be pushed into the dustbin of history. So accelerationism, if we want a definition, and again, this is a kind of emerging movement, and we are sure to leave some things out, but accelerationism is a political and philosophical idea that argues for intensifying or speeding up the process of, of capitalism and technological change to reach a transformative and revolutionary outcome. This outcome will be a decisive break with the past, and it could be utopian or it could be dystopian. From our perspective, very, very difficult to predict what exactly will happen. And all of the people who identify as accelerationists, they do acknowledge that, the future could take many forms, but it will be different. So the accelerationists object to both humanism and political liberalism because they see both as intellectually outdated and strategically incapable of addressing the structural crises of contemporary techno capitalism. Okay, so what do we mean by humanism and political liberalism? So, humanism is a philosophical stance that emphasizes human agency and autonomy. It recognizes the importance of the individual, whom is the starting point for serious moral and philosophical inquiry. Humanism emphasizes reason and rationality as a method of problem solving. Now, political liberalism is the application of humanism in a political context. So the focus is on individual rights, freedom, equality, human welfare, and human flourishing, and governance by consent, right? Liberalism holds that the central problem of politics is the protection of individual freedom and liberty. So humanism and political liberalism are closely related. with political liberalism being heavily influenced by humanist values like the importance of individual autonomy, reason, and human dignity. Both share a commitment to the belief in the potential of individuals to improve the world through incremental rational action. And so the accelerationists, however, reject the human subject as the measure of value in ethics and politics. And again, this is something that they have in common with the post-humanists like Deleuze and other people that we looked at. And so we can think about the limitations of political liberalism. Uh, I mean, liberalism or liberal humanism naively assumes that humans can remain the measure of all things, even as the systems that we have created, financial markets, self-replicating machines, algorithms that write themselves. How are we supposed to? How is a system that was created in the 18th century supposed to keep up and constrain all of these technological developments? It's kind of silly when you think about that. So developments in economics and technology have already exceeded the human ability to understand and control. Like that's not something that might occur in the future. That has already happened. And so humanist ideas like dignity, freedom, democratic consensus, and participation, these aren't liberatory anymore. In fact, these antiquated ideas have become constraints on progress, impeding the forces that could create a radical new future. One of the main arguments that the accelerationists make is that humanism rests on a false picture of human subjectivity and agency. Humanism centers on the autonomous rational subject. It assumes that humans are stable agents and that rational deliberation should guide political action, and that humans can consciously control social and technological systems. But this is a naive view because in reality, human behavior is shaped by impersonal systems, systems of capital, computational infrastructures, logistics networks. Agency is fragmented. It's dispersed across human and non-human actors, algorithms, markets, institutions. So humanism has become an obstacle to clear thinking about modernity. In fact, all humanism offers is nostalgia in a post-human world. Humanism looks backwards, trying to protect an older idea of self, an older system, but technology and capital dissolve traditional identities and communities. And so trying to return to the human is impossible and politically paralyzing. Okay, who is taking this seriously? Well, there are a lot of people in tech who are drawn to accelerationism, and I think that the reasons why are not all that surprising. Accelerationism rationalizes the worldview that technological intensification is inevitable and desirable. Also, it reinforces the view that technology is the true engine of historical transformation. Accelerationism provides a philosophical justification for disruption, a sense of revolutionary purpose, an alternative to the stagnant liberal policies of conventional politics, and a narrative that centers around innovation. So tech workers already live inside of accelerationist logic, and it explains and legitimizes what they already take to be real. And so, yeah, tech billionaires in particular are drawn to this view. People like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. And of course, if you think about it, these are leaders in technological disruption, and they seem to believe that the world is inevitably heading for some type of crisis, some type of collapse. And it makes sense. If you're a billionaire, you're kind of antecedently positioned, in the aftermath of whatever it is that's going to come, whatever it is that's going to take shape, that you're well positioned to shape the world that comes next. And I think that is a big draw for these people, for sure. There are three basic approaches to accelerationism that cross the political spectrum. All agree that we should embrace the productive forces of capitalism and technology to move to a radical new future. But there's some disagreement about what that future entails. So there's left-wing accelerationism. Here we should push capitalism and technology to the breaking point to usher in an abundant and egalitarian future in which humanity is liberated from wage labor. There is right-wing accelerationism. Here we should use capitalism and technology to undermine existing democratic and social institutions in order to create a more efficient techno-feudal order, usually some form of authoritarianism. Finally, there are the techno-optimists, and they argue that we should embrace all forms of technological development in order to enhance humanity and transcend our biological limitations. Okay, left-wing accelerationism. The left-wing accelerationists see advanced technology as a potentially emancipatory tool. It could free humanity from being controlled by corporations or the state. So instead of opposing capitalism, as traditional Marxism had, we should embrace capitalism, but push it to a point to where it begins to undermine itself through its own contradictions. Then we could open up the possibility of a truly post-capitalistic world. Now, this is different from traditional Marxism. Under traditional Marxism, capitalism is seen as a historical stage that will eventually collapse on its own. The goal of the traditional Marxist is to replace capitalism through slow, organized, dialectical transformation, like building worker consciousness with planned collective action. Now, traditional Marxism sees technology mostly as a tool of exploitation. After all, technology is shaped by class relations. And so under capitalism, technology has primarily been used for oppression. So technology must be seized and repurposed under collective ownership. Now the left-wing accelerationists take a different view. Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, for example, see capitalism and technology as potentially tools of liberation and emancipation. They accept that capitalism is has powerful, productive, and technological forces. But they argue that the left must intensify and repurpose those forces rather than resist them. So, for example, automation, which under capitalism is a threat to the livelihood of workers, automation could be repurposed to reduce dependence on wage labor. Increased abundance could not simply create surplus value for the owners of capital, but it could push society towards a future of automation and collective ownership. So it could completely reorient the economy in favor of the workers. So the point is not to resist or slow the forces of capitalism. The point is to push productive forces beyond capitalist limitations. And so the motto of left-wing accelerationism is to use the machine against itself. Now, Cernicek and Williams agree that capitalism has created a world of technological stagnation and austerity. But in response to this, traditional leftist politics, what they derisively refer to as folk politics, has failed to challenge this system effectively because of a lack of vision and scale. In contrast, Cernicek and Williams envision a strong technocratic state to repurpose capitalistic technologies, to manage and promote automation, to ensure access to basic services, and to provide a universal basic income to everyone. Paul Mason. Now, Mason sometimes gets discussed in connection with accelerationism, but he has explicitly rejected this label. He defines himself in a more traditional democratic socialist way, but there's a lot of overlap between Mason and thinkers like Cernicek and Williams. And so I think he is relevant to this discussion. Mason argues that technology is destabilizing capitalism by distorting the market's price mechanism and undermining the profit motive. He argues that new technological advancements could create abundance, paving the way for a new economic system based on sharing rather than profit making. Now, artificial scarcity, Mason argues, is the only thing that maintains prices in the current system. Artificial scarcity raises prices in capitalism or under capitalism by restricting the supply of a good or service below what is technologically or materially possible, thereby increasing its exchange value. In capitalism, this connects directly with the profit motive. So when supply decreases, holding demand constant, the price will go up. Artificial scarcity means that the supply of things is intentionally limited, not because materials are unavailable, but because restricting output makes the product more valuable and hence more profitable. But Mason argues that as technology advances, it will become harder to maintain the system of profit. And ultimately, things will have no cost. And here we can look at the example of digital goods. Digital goods have near zero marginal cost. At this point, the very concept of private ownership essentially becomes meaningless. At the same time, widespread automation will reduce the need for human labor, and this will lead to a society where people are freed from the necessity of traditional employment. Open source knowledge production will transform the relationship between owners and laborers. And here I think of Marx's critique of labor and alienation. And for Marx, human labor was almost the definitive characteristic of what gave people dignity and really was the essence of their humanity. And I wonder, what would a world look like that was characterized by this level of abundance? And it's an interesting question. Mason argues that eventually we can transition to a post-capitalist society where labor is automated and the fruits of the knowledge economy are available equally to everyone. Now, like Cernicek and Williams, Mason argues that ordinary people must consciously direct society towards these type of emancipatory goals. And so we're going to need very strong, robust democratic institutions, actual democratic institutions, functional democratic institutions that don't simply rubber stamp what an oligarchy or some kind of cartel wants, but actual functioning democratic institutions where people have control. Without democratic oversight, there is a danger that elites will use these technologies to exert unprecedented control and undermine civil society. All right, right-wing accelerationism. So this is a neo-reactionary movement that has embraced a form of accelerationism. They argue that the current liberal democratic system is inherently unstable, inefficient, and self-destructive. Now, this critique of political liberalism is nothing new. I mean, this really goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. We certainly can see the critique in the writings of Carl Schmitt and the fascists. So yeah, there's nothing new in this critique. But the accelerationists are arguing that we need to actively undermine the social and political institutions of liberalism in order to make way for some type of new authoritarianism. Now, right-wing accelerationists are not exactly clear as to precisely what this means, but it would be a figure like yeah, a dictator or a CEO or even a monarch who would be able to take the long view, who would not be constrained by the short-term thinking that is attendant to constitutional republicanism or parliamentarianism or liberal democracy or whatever form of government we're talking about. Those governments simply are not capable of dealing with the economic and technological changes that are on the horizon. So we need a lifetime leader who will have a vested interest in long-term stability and prosperity. Again, this will be accomplished not by reform, but by revolution. We need to push capitalism to its extreme. This will lead to an unpredictable post-human future dominated by self-perpetuating technological growth which cannot be constrained or controlled. So the only hope we have is by that time we will have some type of government that will function more like a corporation, and that corporatized government will have some type of accountable leadership that has a long-term interest in stability. So Curtis Yarvin is probably the best known of the right-wing accelerationist. And Yarvin argues that politicians in a democracy only gain power by promising benefits. And this, of course, leads to unsustainable expansion of government. Eventually, it leads to economic decline because we can no longer figure out ways to pay for government largesse and social decay. Democracy incentivizes short-term decision-making over long-term stability as political parties compete to distribute all available resources within the span of a single election cycle. Certainly, Yarvin is on point here. We see this. This is commonplace today, that political parties can no longer think about the long-term well-being of the nation because they're fixated on the next political cycle. And of course, if you can't figure out a way to get and maintain power, it doesn't matter what you want to do. You're not going to be able to enact your reforms, or you're not going to be able to benefit your supporters. So, yeah, Yarvin is onto something here. Yarvin also claims that American governance is dominated by a de facto ruling class that is unaccountable and undemocratic. He argues that in our system, informal decentralized institutions like corporations, administrative agencies, the media, and universities shape public opinion in a self-reinforcing ideological system that limits actual political choice. And Yarvin refers to this as the cathedral. Elite universities shape thinking. They determine what counts as legitimate knowledge. The media creates public consensus and delegitimizes dissenting views. A variety of administrative agencies and civil service agencies perpetuate policies regardless of democratic demands or electoral politics. And together, these form an ecosystem of mutually affirming institutions, which exercises power not coercively, but through the shaping of public opinion. And this is the cathedral, right? The cathedral exercises distributed cultural power, not through law, but through credentialed expertise, narrative dominance, administrative inertia, social and professional coercion. Thus, while democracy creates the appearance of political contestation, the cathedral provides continuity of ideology regardless of who is in office. Liberal democracy offers only the illusion of freedom, not actual freedom. Elections don't change anything. They don't change the system. They don't upset the status quo. It's not really a mechanism by which we can engender true political reform because all the candidates are the same. Essentially, they're working for the same boss. So the system has been captured by government bureaucrats, media corporations, and the academic elite. So this anarcho-tyranny is actually more coercive than explicit tyranny because it's accepted as being the norm. It's accepted as being morally correct. Now, somewhat ironically, I think that this echoes, the critical theorist like Adorno and Benjamin and Horkheimer and even Marcuse when we talk about the way that the apparatus of capitalism and the apparatus liberal democracy, how they actually function to oppress and marginalize dissenting views. So there's some similarity here. Now, Yarvin popularized the very famous red pill meme, but I guess even more unfortunately, this meme has been captured by the manosphere, so it's kind of being misapplied now. Um, Originally, the meme referred to the Wachowskis' film The Matrix. A little bit of irony here, if you know who the Wachowskis are, and if you know, you know. Um, it was originally, right, when you go back to the film, you see Morpheus here is offering Neo two choices. If he takes the blue pill, everything goes back to normal and he goes back to his cubicle and everything stays the same. But if he takes the red pill, if he becomes red pilled, he will liberate himself from the power of the cathedral. He will no longer live, right? We will no longer live under the delusion of the liberal democratic orthodoxy. And this is how, in the film, Neo is he sees reality for what it is. But of course, in this meme, Yarvin is saying that if we take the red pill, we will no longer be under the power and the sway of the cathedral. Now, instead of democracy, Yarvin promotes a system he calls neocameralism, and he advocates running the government more like a corporation. So under this model, the government is owned by shareholders, and the CEO or monarch or whatever type of authoritarian leader we have will be able to run the state efficiently with clear authority, and there's no need for mass participation in government. And he imagines that corporations run this way. The shareholders have a stake in the corporation, an ownership stake, and there's a CEO and a board, and the CEO and the board are fiduciaries to the corporation itself and to the shareholders, and so they must always act in the best interest of the company. And there's no, there is efficiency because you don't have the kind of democratic or judicial oversight that mucks everything up in a liberal democracy. And so the CEO is able to do whatever is needed to be done. And there's absolutely no need for mass participation in governance in the same way that shareholders do not participate in the day-to-day operations of a corporation, right? So there's a lot of efficiency. Now, Yarvin argues that the reason that modern states function so poorly is because there is no actual accountability. So it would be better to run the state like a for-profit company with the aim of maximizing shareholder value. Then, just as corporations want to retain customers by providing a better product or service than competitors, a neo-cameralist state would try to retain citizens by offering better safety and prosperity. So here, the metaphor or the analogy here is to that citizens are like shareholders. They don't participate in the operational control of the state or the corporation, but they kind of choose with their feet. They will go wherever they get the best deal, right? And that's how the system is incentivized. Now, because power is tied to financial ownership, Those who own shares in the state will have their incentives aligned with its future stability and prosperity. Their wealth depends on success of the state, and so executive decisions will not be shaped by short-term electoral factors, but rather fear of decreasing the value of the government shares. And so again, I think that Yarvin is kind of stretching the metaphor here, because in practice, executives, while they sometimes act as fiduciaries, often they act in their own short-term interest, and they get, these huge compensatory contracts and things that are not tied to the performance of the company in any way. But I think you can see where Yarvin is going with this. If we had an executive who had the power to essentially do anything that was necessary, and there was no constraint on that power, and that executive did in fact act as a fiduciary, then they would be able to take into account the long-term interest and viability of the state in a way that a short-term leader like a democratically elected president is not, or cannot do. Now, like consumers, Yarvin asserts that individuals will have the option to exit the system if they don't like how it's being managed, in exactly the same way that if I own equity shares in a company, my investment is liquid. I can liquidate that investment at any time if it's a publicly traded company and move on to a company that I like. And so this should create a dynamic market for governance, driving efficiency and innovation as corporate city states compete with each other for citizens. Okay. Yeah. Uh, that to me does not sound very realistic at all for a variety of factors and a variety of reasons. But, I can see in theory, I suppose it works. Now, critics of Yarvin had pointed out that handing absolute power to a CE monarch might be a bad idea. In fact, it might lead to serious abuse and repression. Power does tend to corrupt, after all, particularly if there are no restraints on how that power is used. I mean, think about it. Can we think of any historical example, where absolute power was given to an authority and they did not abuse that power? I mean, we have to go all the way back to General Cincinnatus in Rome, right? This is not a great track record. There are tons of examples in both the business world and the political world of where, if you have a centralized authority, you're going to get abuse. You're going to get exploitation. You're going to get oppression. And because the primary value behind neocameralism is increasing profit and shareholder value, wow, exploitation and oppression seem inevitable. And to me, honestly, it just does not seem like Yarvin has much experience in business at all. I mean, this metaphor completely breaks down. States are not corporations, and citizens are not reducible to consumers. And even if a state could operate like a business, I mean, we think about this. This is not necessarily a good thing. If we look at the way that businesses are actually run, right? Businesses frequently fail catastrophically. And the only reason, I mean, if you think about the whole justification behind the corporate person, the justification behind the corporate person is that you create a fictitious legal identity for the corporation. So investors will not have their personal assets attached if there's failure, because failure is common, right? Businesses fail all the time. And you don't want creditors going after your personal assets. And so usually investors risk only their investment, right? Unless there's fraud or something. So this is actually a pretty poor metaphor. And if we think about the way that businesses succeed only when there is a functioning market, and there will be a functioning market only when there is sufficient government management of that market, because unrestrained markets always devolve into, you know, monopoly or monopsony or oligopoly, or you get price fixing or a variety of different, what we refer to as antitrust violations, right? So you need and even if like you read Adam Smith or you read any of the, the seminal free market economists, there's always the recognition that markets need to be strongly regulated by the government, right, in order to function at all. And so here, right, the whole metaphor seems to break down, right? Even assuming that the board and the CEO or the dictator or the monarch or whatever was genuinely in good faith acting like a fiduciary. But what's the chances of that? I mean, if you look at human history, what's the chances that a leader entrusted with all of that power is going to actually act in the interest of the state and the people? In practice, concentrated power nearly always fosters corruption, incompetence, and extraction rather than disciplined management. You get concentrated power, no democratic oversight, no functioning rule of law, no guardrails to protect you against kleptocracy and oligarchy and tyranny. You want Russia? That's how you get Russia. Perhaps the strongest argument in favor of liberal democracy is the most obvious one. Despite the apparent inefficiency, democratic society and democratic societies have historically produced far more stability, prosperity, productivity, and innovation than any autocracy. That's just a fact. The economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, they have a fantastic book called Why Nations Fail. And in that book, they propose that nations can only prosper when they have institutions that protect property rights, enforce the rule of law, and allow broad participation in economic and political life. Such institutions create incentives for individuals to work, to invest, to be productive, to innovate, because these individuals trust the system. They know that they will benefit from their own efforts. In contrast, nations fail when they develop extractive institutions, systems that concentrate power, that concentrate wealth in the hands of a small elite. This will stifle innovation. This will encourage corruption and take away opportunity. They also refer to something called the iron law of oligarchy. Even when extractive regimes collapse, new elites often replace the old ones without changing the system at all. This circulation of elites keeps nations trapped in poverty and oppression. Now, Nick Land and the Dark Enlightenment. The Dark Enlightenment, that sounds pretty intimidating. What is Land referring to here? Well, again, and Land has this in common with Curtis Yarvin and the like. Land sees liberal democracy as an obstacle to the goals of stability and prosperity, and he advocates for its rapid destabilization. And again, to summarize the argument, democracies are incapable of taking the long view because political leaders in a democracy are trapped in very short election cycles. And when they have access to resources, they tend to distribute those resources to their supporters in order to keep and retain power. And this prohibits a kind of long-term view that would take into account the long-term interest and well-being of the state. So he rejects the view that history is progressing towards greater liberty and greater inclusion, right? Like Yarvin, he argues that we should return to some form of absolute monarchism. And again, Land, like Yarvin, is a little bit unclear as to exactly what that means, but it certainly would entail some form of authoritarianism. Now, when we refer to the Dark Enlightenment, what does that mean? The Dark Enlightenment is a reactionary movement that rejects humanism and argues for a return to hierarchical social structures and an authoritarian form of government. The movement critiques Enlightenment ideas by challenging the belief of inevitable democratic progress towards greater freedom. In fact, Land argues ultimately that democracy is incompatible with freedom. Now, this is a fairly old critique, and they're always, like political theorists, have always recognized the tension between political liberalism, which is predicated on the idea of the absolute value of the individual, and democracy, which is predicated on the idea that the majority should rule. And de Tocqueville pointed this out, and many commentators have pointed this out. And there are a variety of ways to try to reconcile these two ideas. And those include some form of representative government or some type of constitutional protections of individual rights. But Land argues that it's just the very idea of democracy is just incompatible with freedom and stifles freedom and innovation. In his view, liberal democracy is a historical anomaly. It only produces mediocrity and decay. The uninformed masses who are entrusted with governance are inevitably captured by feedback loops of populism and identity politics. And yes, of course, we can see that playing out now. Also, he points out that these masses cannot adapt to the increasing complexity of the world or keep pace with technological acceleration. I think that's obviously true. Not even the experts can keep pace with the rapid advancements in technological acceleration. And there's kind of an iron law in technology. If something can be made, it will be made. A technological determinism, we refer to that as technological determinism. If something is theoretically possible, well, somebody will do it somewhere, and that will have profound implications, legal implications, ethical implications, social implications, political implications, economic implications, and we aren't in a position to assess that or sometimes even understand what's going on. And so, how can the masses who, in a democracy, have ultimate say over who's in charge and what we should do? How can the masses have anything relevant to say about that? And so that's a problem. That is definitely a problem. And land makes note of that. So the principles of the Dark Enlightenment. Liberal democracy has failed. And again, we've seen this with Carl Schmitt. We have seen this with the critical theorists. We have seen this with the Marxists. We have seen this with uh, uh, Gentile and Mussolini in fascism. We see this critique going all the way back to Plato, all the way back to Aristotle. This is not a new critique. Yet liberal democracy, limps on. From Land's point of view, democracy is inefficient and inevitably leads to stagnation. Right? Exit over voice. Here, Land is referring to uh, the idea of exit. What does that mean? Well, rather than reforming the system, Land promotes the idea of exit, where the most competent or wealthy should separate themselves from the masses. And I don't know if this explains why people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are building these gigantic bunkers, or Peter Thiel, but it may have something to do with all of that, right? That the end is coming and you need to prepare for that. And you also need to prepare for what comes after, and who is, again, better positioned to do that than a tech billionaire. Hyper capitalism and techno-autocracy. So we must create a world where artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, automation, and corporate power surpasses human governance. Human governance is acting to constrain innovation and technology, not to facilitate it. And so what we need is a kind of technocratic or even a neo-monarchist rule. And again, Land is a little bit vague here, but we get the point. So in order to control and constrain, or not constrain, but to harness the forces of technology, we're going to need some form of centralized power that can steer the masses, or better yet, simply ignore the masses as they're excluded from public participation, and direct the country where it needs to go. So in the future, Land envisions a world where capitalism and technology escapes human control completely. And that is a brave new world, folks. That's a post-human world, right? Society and politics will be reshaped by machine intelligence. And Land says, in order not only to get there, but to thrive in this new environment, democracy must be committed to the waste bin with all other forms of political liberalism and humanism and Enlightenment humanism. All of it has to go. So democracy will be discarded as a sentimental relic, and humanism finally will be overcome. Now, what comes next? Again, Land is, I think, purposely vague here. But whatever comes next will be radically different from the world that we inhabit now. And the time frame is probably shorter than you think. I think Land and Yarvin believe that they will witness, whatever is coming, that they will witness that in their lifetime, and they're probably right. And what exactly that world looks like, difficult to say. Very difficult to say. So, is authoritarianism inevitable in some way? So, the critique of democracy and humanism, this is not new, folks. This is not new at all. And in fact, probably the best critique of democracy came from Plato and Aristotle. Plato argued that democracy leads to political and social instability because the majority of people are simply uninformed and incapable of governance. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, if Plato is saying that the people are uninformed in as simple a society as ancient Greece, I mean, imagine what he would have to say about the complex economic and social and technological issues that we face today. So, uh, from Plato's point of view, the people simply were uninformed and lacked the expertise to govern. And the people, of course, look at freedom as the supreme good, but the people understand freedom outside the context of political and social and moral responsibility. They see freedom as simply the ability to do anything they want to do. And so Plato argues that this ultimately leads to the elevation of desire over reason. And so citizens in a democracy come to see freedom as simply a license to do whatever you want to do, regardless of the contribution of that to the well-being of the state. And so ultimately, this ends up in tyranny because freedom becomes chaos, it becomes anarchy. And in that type of situation, the people will crave order and security. And then you get a demagogue, right? The leader, the populist leader who arises, who promises that they can take care of everything, that they will make the people safe, that they will bring prosperity. But of course, this is just lies. Um, and gradually, this leader will concentrate more and more power until they become a tyrant. Thus, for Plato, democracy contains within it the instability that ultimately leads to despotism. Aristotle had a similar critique of democracy, and he, of course, identified democracy with rule of the poor or mob rule. And he said this was a deviant form of government. He had respect and admiration for things like representative governments, like a constitutional government, where the people come together and rule for the common good. And like going back to our discussion on Rousseau, and I think this is exactly what Rousseau has in mind in separating ordinary representative democracies from a democracy where the people rule on their own, but rule for the common good, or what he termed the general will. So we have to remember that was, remember, uh, his critique of representative government was that it was easily captured by special interest, and unless the will of the majority was tempered by the general will, there would be anarchy. And so for Aristotle, because the poor are guided by their own self-interest and base desires, there will be a tendency to ignore the common good, and we get the same despotic outcome. So both philosophers agreed or argued that democracy will inevitably lead to some type of chaos, and this will create the opportunity for a charismatic leader to arise and manipulate the masses with false promises, with simple solutions for complex problems. And ultimately, what we get is some type of authoritarianism or tyranny. Now, however, societies with strong democratic traditions, robust institutions, and a functioning rule of law, and a citizen body that is actively engaged in civic matters can probably resist authoritarianism. checks and balances, a free media, an informed citizenry, legal safeguards that are taken seriously, a constitution that actually has meaning, a due process, and a system of checks and balances that can kind of act as guardrails against the concentration of power. These can all help prevent authoritarian drift, but ultimately, in the final analysis, it is up to us as citizens, or citizens in a democratic country, we get the type of government we deserve. And if we allow democratic institutions to fail, well, then we have to live with that failure. Um, and there's a story about Ben Franklin, and I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, but it's a good story. And after the Constitutional Convention, a woman came up to Franklin and said, Mr. Franklin, what type of government are we to be? And Franklin looked at her and says, we are a republic as long as you can keep it. So here, again, in the final analysis, if we are to remain a constitutional republic, that's going to be up to the people. Now, techno-optimism. What is techno-optimism? Well, the techno-optimists are accelerationists, and they see that, the end is nigh, so to speak, for our current era. But they see technology as a solution, not a problem. So the techno-optimists see technological disruption not as a threat, but rather the primary driver of human achievement. So we should do everything in our power to usher in this new era of AGI, of automation, all of these things that we find so threatening, in fact, will be our salvation. So accelerating technological advancement is the best way to enhance and improve our humanity. So some of the techno-optimists are transhumanists. So one way that we can keep up with technological innovation is to apply those innovations to ourselves, to augment our cognitive capacity so we can compete with machines. So AI, AGI, automation, biotech, quantum computing, these will, if given enough time and given enough resources, these will solve major global problems: poverty, disease, climate change, right? Technology can address these problems faster than regulation or political reform alone. So we need to embrace these technologies, not be fearful of them. We need to bypass restrictive regulations and cultural resistance that might slow the pace of innovation. We should actively push for faster technological breakthroughs. And so right now, there are people talking about the problems of AI and how we should put in safety nets and guardrails, but no, we should be allowing technologists to develop these new technologies faster and more efficiently. So some of the techno-optimists see or envision a transhumanist future or a post-human future where our current biological limitations can be transcended by technological augmentation. And many techno-optimists will argue that even death is something that can be overcome. And if we learn to augment ourselves, if we map human consciousness and we're able to recreate super powerful minds technologically, if we can enhance our own cognitive abilities, if we can hijack our immune system with biotech and nanotech, we will be able to cheat death. And that's an interesting possibility. And I have to say that, you know, if that is true, well, sign me up. Because I'm interested. So noted transhumanists like Ray Kurzweil, Hans Moravec, and Zoltan Istvan are optimistic about the use of technology to enhance human cognition and bodily function beyond current biological constraints. And so here's a quote from Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil, I've read many of his books. He's an interesting writer. He is one of the most enthusiastic of the techno optimists. And he says by the time we get to the 2040s, not that far away, we will be able to multiply human intelligence a billion-fold. That will be a profound change. Yeah, understatement there. That's singular in nature. Computers are going to keep getting smaller and smaller. Ultimately, they will go inside our bodies, inside our brains, and make us healthier and make us smarter. And there is at least the potential for that, certainly. Hard to disagree when you look at the pace of the almost exponential pace of technological growth. And of course, that there are cycles in growth and things, technologies get hyped and then they don't quite meet expectations. And then people start ignoring them, but then they come back stronger. And we've seen that with robotics. We're going to see that with AI. And there's a kind of, an accelerating curve of technology. But once these, particularly these self-replicating or self-improving technologies get underway, it's going to radically transform society. Now, I don't know that that's going to be in a positive way, as Kurzweil thinks, and even Kurzweil is, he makes no guarantees. The future is very difficult to predict, but Kurzweil is saying that we will see, the singularity, and we will see things within our lifetime for sure. So, is there actually cause for techno optimism? Well, man, I read a lot of these people, and what they all have in common is they all, they all, they all admit that uh, that the future is difficult to predict with any degree of accuracy. Although I think they are all in agreement, and we should be all in agreement that our near future, even our near future, is going to be radically different than the world we live in now. These technologies are I don't know if they're going to make the world better, but they certainly will make the world different. And it is true that the rate of technological change has overtaken our ability to comprehend the implications of what we're creating. We don't know. We are creating machines that can replicate themselves and improve themselves. How does that all end? Like, where does that end up? Nobody knows. But looking at artificial intelligence, for example, man, it is very unlikely that society can avoid serious disruption. I just don't see how. It's not simply going to be a tool that's going to make our lives more efficient and better. It's not like previous technological developments. I think it's going to radically change everything. Most everyone who studies this topic agrees. They don't agree that the future will be better, but the future definitely is going to be different. So artificial intelligence is currently accelerating its own progress and likely will soon outpace our ability to exercise human oversight. What happens then? AI might also facilitate the concentration of power to an unprecedented scale. We may see a future where just a handful of tech companies that have essentially a monopoly on certain technologies are able to concentrate power on a scale we've never seen before. Now, that's certainly a dystopia. And that, I think, is as likely a possibility as anything. Maybe governments become irrelevant as these tech companies monopolize their discoveries. And the future is a future of exploitation and oppression, or simply a future where most humans are irrelevant. Think about that. Don't want to. Right? And this, of course, reminds me of an article in Wired magazine, and it was an article by William Joy, who was a technology writer, and this was even before AI, right? This was before the wave of innovation and artificial intelligence or quantum computing or all of that. And William Joy wrote this essay in Wired magazine, and it was very prescient. It was titled "Why the Future Does Not Need Us," right? So this line has always stood out to me, and I think it's a profound insight, right? Biological species almost never survive encounters with a superior competitor. Biological species almost never survive encounters with a superior competitor. And human beings are now on the threshold of developing a superior competitor. How do you think that's going to work out for us? Not great, right? Not great. All right. Well, I hope that was edifying. I had a good time. I hope that you guys found that to be useful. And it certainly is interesting, and things are changing even as we speak. So I'll probably revise this in the future.